the frontier Switzerland, Waziristan in 1884, Across the Border, or Pathans and Baloch, by Oliver Edwards Emerson. Between the bloody border at the base of Solomon's throne and the snowy peaks of the Sufedko, or White Mountains, lies the great country of Waziristan, the Switzerland of the northwest frontier. A land of high and difficult hills, deep and rugged defiles, brave and hardy people, in their way as independent and patriotic, and in the presence of the common enemy, hardly less united than the famous compatriots of Tell. Geographically and politically, the two have several points in common, and as regards the mass of hills that lie between the Gumal and the Tochi, or Dawar Valley, of which Kanigurum, the stronghold of the most powerful of the Waziri tribes, is about the center, this is more especially true. The east front is protected by the bare hills held by the Pathans, beyond which are ravines, flanked by precipitous cliffs, which occasionally widen out to enclose small valleys fairly fertile, from 100 to 1,000 yards wide, but narrowing again as they ascend. Not unfrequently the mouth is a mere gorge or tanki, where the water forces its way through a range crossing it at right angles and forming a colossal natural barrier. In these valleys, and the small strips of alluvial land which border the base of the higher mountains, locally called caches, which are quite a distinctive feature of the whole range, there is often a good deal of cultivation, the whole carefully terraced and irrigated by means of channels cut out of the hillsides, a great deal of ingenuity and skill being expended in leading the water from field to field. The edges of the fields, which correspond with the side of the watercourse, are planted with mulberry and willows, the houses of the owners being perched picturesquely on the slopes above. Lower down, where the valley narrows to the tangi, paved with rough boulders and stones, difficult enough in ordinary times, but probably filled by a roaring torrent in the rains, the Waziri has been provided by nature with the most magnificent defensive position, the valleys behind furnishing a camping ground and a base of supplies. Until the Dawar Valley is reached, there are no passes leading directly through the country, though the Tank Zam from Dera Ismail Khan and the Shakdu and Kaiser from Banu afford access to the heart of it. From the west it is even less accessible, and practically it has always been independent of Kabul. Secure in a long line of mountain fastnesses, possessing considerable natural resources, and with constitutions that would enable them to live where most other people would starve, the Waziris could probably not be dislodged by any force which the Emir is able to detail against them. Even in our case, advancing from our adjacent frontier lines, it took nearly 7,000 men and cost us over 350 lives to get to Kanigurum in 1860, though the whole country could, if necessary, be dominated by us without much difficulty. The inhabitants of these mountain homes are essentially a self-governed people. They are eminently a fighting people, but still more essentially and eminently are they a thieving people. From the comparatively civilized Darwesh of Banu, who if he cannot steal a pony will take a bicycle, to the ruder Mahsood, described as the earliest, most inveterate, and most incorrigible robber of all. This characteristic is the most prominent, and they are proud of it. Every true man's apparel fits your Waziri. The traveling Pawinder is his oyster, and he is ready, on every opportunity, sword in hand, to open the latter's bales, to cut his throat, and to convey, rather than steal his goods back to the passes. They are the most numerous, and in spite of intertribal feuds, probably the most united of all our northwest tribes. Of blood feuds and family feuds they have many. These are luxuries it would be unreasonable to expect any Pathan tribe to give up, but their very democratic arrangements, observed in the distribution of lands amongst the various sections, and the manner in which these sections and their subdivisions are scattered over the face of the country, have contributed to make any formidable intertribal feuds more uncommon. And it is to this, added to the natural strength of its position, that Waziristan is not a little indebted for its independence. Taking into account all those who would be classed as Waziris, their united tribal strength would be in excess of 40,000 fighting men. A contingent that, when the quality is taken into consideration, would be no mean addition to the resources of ourselves, or, and the problem is worthy the consideration of the backward school, of our enemies. Tribally, the Waziri is split up into the usual complication of branches, sections, divisions, and subdivisions, the enumeration of which would be clearly a multiplying of words without knowledge. Nor would it be profitable to try and work out the descent of Wazir bin Suleiman from Saul, or even Qais, to the various Musas, Mahmoods, and Mahsoods, whose names are still borne by the clans. By far the most important of the main branches are the Darwesh Khels and the Mahsoods. A few representatives of tribes like the Lalais extend up to the slopes of the Safed-Koh, or Spinjar, as the Waziris would call what they say was the original home from whence they came, and some of the Gurbas reside on the borders of coast, but no great numbers are located north of the Kurum. The Darwesh Khels consist of two great sections, the Utmanzais and the Ahmadzais, again split into divisions and subdivisions, important enough from a tribal point of view, but which there is no reason to particularize. The first sections are mainly on the right bank of the Kurum, occupying the hills between the coast and Dawar valleys. Some cultivate lands within our border, and others regularly come in to trade. Another division, the Kabul Khels, are extremely wild and lawless, ready to join with anyone in mischief and devilry, and have, as the frontier reports put it, given a good deal of trouble. An expression somewhat comprehensive, as for instance, it covers the fact that in 1 year they made 20 raids, finishing up with a murderous attack on some Banuchi villages, some 14 of which they sacked and burnt. In return for which, Nicholson, whose name by the way is now as a household god among them, penetrated with 1,500 men into the heart of their country and retaliated in kind on their villages. Subsequently, in 1859, they came in for a second expedition all to themselves, under Chamberlain, the punishment for an audacious attack on Bahada Khel and the salt mines. The Ahmadzai branch are mainly on the left bank of the Kurum, north of Banu, though probably there are now nearly as many residing within our border as beyond it. On the banks of the Kurum and the Kaitu, which flows into it, both enjoy broad tracts of rich soil, and the hills which surround them, whose jagged walls conceal many a grassy slope, afford good pastures for their camels and flocks. Their proper settlements, if they can be said to have any, are up on the higher spurs, but of regular villages they have few, residing mainly in kiris or encampments, sometimes protected with a wall of loose stones, often merely stout woolen blankets stretched over curved sticks, which, like the Irish cabins, are shared with their cattle and the family camel, and guarded by the family dogs of a particularly large and fierce breed. The most permanent thing they ever possess are the tribal graveyards, which are scattered over most hillsides and are perhaps the only places they hold sacred. The boldest thief among them will keep his sacrilegious hands off any property deposited among the tombs. The lands of both sections of the Darwesh Khels extend moreover all around the Tochi or Dawar Valley, though not into it, the inhabitants of that valley being, curiously enough, almost a distinct race, greatly inferior in physique, in morals, and in courage. And considering the intense contempt in which a Dawari is held by the Waziris, and the small scruple the latter usually has regarding his neighbour's landmark, why they have permitted so important a highway through their country to remain in what might fairly be considered alien hands, is a somewhat curious problem. Something will be said hereafter about the Dawaris and the Tochi, a route of the greatest importance to us, but to dispose first of our Waziri friends and the most important and powerful branch of all, the Mahsoods, whose country around Kanigurum has already been referred to. These are subdivided into three main sections: the Balozai, the Alizai, and the Shaman Kel, the first named being probably facile princeps in the noble profession of robber, and as robbery is, unless it be done on a sufficiently large scale, opposed to the policy of the British government, they are consequently our most inveterate foes. In this respect, it is unnecessary to institute any comparison between the dwellers in Waziristan and those in the Swiss Alps. The boast of the former, that, while kingdoms and dynasties have passed away, they alone, of all the Afghan tribes, have remained free, and that the armies of kings have failed to penetrate their strongholds, might strike a chord of sympathy, but they continue in a strain most reprehensible, to the effect that they know no law or will but their own, and from generation to generation, the plain country has provided them with a fair hunting ground for plunder. The merry Switzer, wiser in his generation, contents himself by taking it out of the traveller in the form of hotel bills. Even the Balozais have, however, had to modify this boast. A series of raids filled up the measure of their iniquities, and in 1860 General Chamberlain forced his way into the heart of their country, to Kanigurum and Makin, and burned the latter. On one or two other occasions the whole Mahsoods were blockaded and paid down a cash indemnity, giving hostages for the observance of the terms imposed on them. Posts were established within the passes of the Patani country, and offences effectually checked for years. In 1879, instigated by emissaries from Kabul, or excited by our proceedings in the Kabul Valley, they became discontented again, and finally, amongst other tribes, came down in force and fired the town of Tank. This led to an expedition under General Kennedy being sent against them in 1881, and they again found that not even their most distant glens or wildest and pathless hills could protect them from punishment, and they ultimately accepted the greatest humiliation a Pathan clan can suffer, surrendering some half-dozen of their proscribed ringleaders and sending 80 hostages to reside in Dera Ismail Khan. One of the ringleaders died in Lahore, and the rest were, in consideration of their furnishing an escort to our survey parties in the Gumal, and their general good behaviour, released in 1884. Physically, they are a fine race, tall, muscular and courageous, in many respects, noble savages. Desperate in their forays, never sparing an enemy of the male sex, even if he be but a Ghilzai boy. Nor does the Ghilzai ever let off a Waziri when he catches him. The Waziri is, on the other hand, so far chivalrous, he will never kill or rob women. He rather prides himself on a certain gallantry in this respect. Like other Pathans, the whole people are given to hospitality. Guests are welcomed by the men and women present in the village with the greeting Hakalar Shi, may you come always, and entertained according to rank. They are generally ignorant, illiterate and superstitious, with dangerously little learning, and show great reverence for mullahs, akhunds and holy men of all sorts, who write charms, read incantations, enjoy alms and pilgrimages, and prescribe for ailments greatly to their own profit. For most complaints, the prescription is uniform and simple, and merely consists of enveloping the patient in the skin of a newly killed sheep until he perspires freely, which, combined with a strong purgative, dry bread, and a good climate and constitution, answers as well as anything else. But unlike other Pathans, they are credited with some regard for honour, and, still more remarkable, with comparative truthfulness. Many of the Waziri customs are also peculiar to themselves. For adultery, they kill the woman, but cut off the nose of the man, though in some cases the lady apparently escapes with the lesser punishment. Their women do not cover their faces, but live freely with the men. The bridegroom gives a dower to the bride's father, in other words, buys his wife. the cost of an eligible young lady ranging from Rs 60 to Rs 150, but this does not prevent her having 50 or 60 bridesmaids who bring double that number of young men and indulge in a regular flare-up, including a dance with a liberal drum accompaniment. Contrary to the usual rule about the avenging of blood feuds, the Waziri greybeard of ancient times ruled that the actual murderer must be the only victim, thus avoiding many of those ramified feuds and indiscriminate vengeance where a blood account current is handed down for generations from father to son, and it ultimately becomes almost impossible to strike a balance. Again, the make-up money or pecuniary commutation has been fixed in the case of Waziri lives at exceptionally high rates. The fixed price for a Waziri, for instance, is Rs 1,300, half of which must be in cash and the other half in produce or commodities, including 2 girls at Rs 100 each. A woman can be killed for half price, or Rs 650, and a longi or silk scarf of Rs 50. The cost of a limb which permanently incapacitates a man is compensated for by a payment of Rs 500, and this is the cost of an eye. The tariff for sword wounds is apportioned much in the same way as cuts on a club billiard cloth and at very nearly the same rates. Rs 12, 8 for the first half inch, but it costs Rs 250 to cut off a nose, by mistake of the Waziri Baron Cresswell presumably, Rs 100 for an ear, and so on, down a scale it would be tedious to extend. The moral to be pointed in connection with the Waziris is, however, less their ethnological peculiarities than the fact of the importance of so large, warlike, and independent a people on our immediate border, a people that cannot be left out of consideration when military interests are at stake. It is notorious that 2 or 3 years ago, the agents of the Emir were doing their utmost to gain over the Mahsoods to surrender their independence, permit posts to be built in their hills, and to pay even the most nominal tithes. So far without success, and as matters now stand, Waziristan is particularly open to British influence, which we could extend without in any way complicating our relations with Kabul. An opportunity that would certainly cease if at any time Kabul garrisons were posted in strong positions in the country. And without some active interference on our part, it is quite within the bounds of possibility that Kabul persistence may establish such a position. The Dawar or Tochi Valley. The Dawar Valley has already been referred to as by no means the least important of the main highways into the heart of Afghanistan. It is considerably shorter. In some respects, it offers more facilities than the Gamal. And though, as a trade route, it is probably never likely to be of much importance, its value for military purposes as affording direct communication with Ghazni or effecting a flank movement on Kabul is even still greater. In the time of the Greek occupation and the early days of Hindu sovereignty, it must have been the scene of constant and direct communication between Western Afghanistan and India. The high mounds at the mouth of the passes and the ancient remains scattered through the valley mark the sites of what were once great and flourishing cities, while it is tolerably certain it was one of the routes most affected by Mahmud of Ghazni, for his raids on India were not aimed directly at Peshawar. And in the ruins of Accra, among the scraps of Buddhist ornaments, Hindu idols, broken bricks and pottery, the hundreds of Ghaznavi coins from the beginning to the end of the dynasty, which are laid bare after heavy rains, furnish a complete record of constant encampments. Like so many others of the passes, the tight places are only at the Indian end, and it is perhaps no exaggeration to say the whole route is better known from Ghazni than from Banu, though the entrances are within a few miles from our outposts and a morning's ride from cantonments. As with some other famous plans for action, there are from the border 3 courses open, all perfectly practicable and of no great length, ways which only need the will to make them perfectly easy, but which, to judge by the holy horror the British government has always seemed to entertain for them, might have all Dante's Purgatorio behind. The Tochi, just opposite the outpost of the same name, is the best known. A mere track, rough and stony, but which is generally fairly level, and at most is only 9 miles long. The Baran, somewhat to the north, much more rocky and more circuitous, involving a detour of about 20 miles, entering the valley near the village of Isori, and a third by the Karsora Pass, about 6 miles south of the Tochi, which was used on the return of the Mahsoods expeditionary force in 1860. The easiest and best of the three, though the longest, a 25-mile march being needed before the valley is reached. Once through this paltry range of almost uninhabited hills, the valley, or rather valleys, for there are two, the upper and lower Dawar, separated by an unimportant tangi or waste, open out into what may almost be called plains, rich, productive, and fairly well cultivated, irrigated by a considerable river, the Tochi, known in British territory as the Gambela, studded with more or less wealthy villages, walled and defended by flanking towers, the whole extending as far as Sharania at the foot of the eastern slope of the Jadran Hills, which form the head of the upper Dawar Valley, and fix the limit of the trade that at present finds its way to India by this route. From Sharania onwards are several routes not quite so plain, so well known, or so open, but which recent information has shown offer no great difficulties. Crossing the range, which is also the watershed dividing the streams flowing to the Indus and the Helmand, the most direct and the easiest passing Urgan, or Waghian as the Waziris call it, and the Kotani Pass leads to Sarafsa at the western foot of the Jadran Range, and from thence by Shilgar to Ghazni, a country which, as the result of the investigations carried on by our native explorers shows, offers no obstacle to military movements. Detailed information is still wanting. One of the last of these explorers, a Sayud, was unluckily suspected and imprisoned at Ghazni, from thence sent on to Kabul, where his survey books were taken from him, though he was eventually allowed to return to India. But from information gathered in this way and sketches taken during various expeditions, the general features are pretty well known. The lower valley, owing to the swampy nature of the ground, is somewhat feverish, though not nearly so bad in that respect as Banu. However, the upper valley is in every way desirable, and at the head of it are breezy, healthy highlands, more than ordinarily fertile and with a splendid climate. A position might be taken up there that would command some of the very best parts of the Afghan border and would, moreover, ensure a grip on some of the best and sturdiest of the independent tribes. To the south lie the highlands of Burmal, a tract of country only lately prospected in the manner just referred to, where rises the main stream of the Tochi. This flows northward through it for 40 or 50 miles, and then enters the upper Dawar by a sudden and sharp bend to the east, flowing on towards the Indus. The course of the river, according to Major Holdig, marks the line of a good road through the length of Burmal, and is connected with its head by an easy pass across a low watershed with the Gumal system southwards. From the eastern slope of what are shown on old maps as the Konok Hills, but are really the southern continuation of the Jadran Range, there rises also an important affluent of the Gumal, called the Dua Gumal. This is a stream not yet surveyed, but described as flowing through open valleys till it joins the main Gumal to the southwest of Waziristan, and would doubtless afford an excellent second line of communication. The waters of the Tochi are sweet and good, and it may always be depended on for a plentiful supply. Along most of its course, the bottom is hard and stony, and though liable to sudden rises, it is never impassable, even for footmen, for more than a few hours. The Dawar Valley throughout is seldom narrower than 1 mile, and in many places 2 or 3 miles wide. A great part of it is well cultivated, a good deal of grain being grown, and the villages are prosperous and possess considerable herds of cattle. Burmal is a more debatable land. Some of the Pawindas graze their cattle there in the summer, and the Waziris apparently hold it in winter. The former, dirty, wild, and unkempt as they may be, do not look as if they came from a bad climate or a poor country. There is probably no reason, save the persistence in a policy of non-interference with the tribes, why a force should not march in at the Tochi, travel round a great part of Waziristan, and out by the Gumal without meeting with any serious difficulty. One of the easiest routes to the Mahsood country is admittedly from the Dawar Valley over the Razmak Sur. West and south of the Jadran Range is a wide, undulating country, gradually flattening into broad level plains with a few isolated hills, affording easy roads to Kandahar, Kailat-e-Gilzai, and Ghazni, from which last the road to Kabul is well known. Of the people who live along this highway, the very name Dawari is a byword of reproach. The Banuchi, according to Edwards, is an exceptionally degraded specimen, with all the vices of the Pathan rankly luxuriant, his virtues stunted, but the Dawari is universally described as somewhat more eminently vicious and additionally degraded. An object of supreme contempt to his warlike neighbors, the Waziris, he is even looked upon as a bad character by a Banuchi. Worse probably could not be said of him. To call him dirty would be almost a compliment. His clothes, usually black cotton to start with, are worn till they would be considered malodorous by a Gilzai. Rankness in this respect is with him a matter of pride, for it indicates he can afford to indulge largely in ghee, or clarified but more or less rancid butter, which is in great demand not only for food, but for anointing his head, his face, and his dress. He will carry, says Hayat Khan, a piece of bread saturated with it in his pocket, or bound up in his clothes, as to him the sweetest scented sachet. His complexion naturally inclines to yellow. As a youth he will stain one eye black and one red. As a young buck have his beard plucked out to keep his face smooth and wear flowers in his turban. As an older warrior, his idea is to shave one side of his face only, stain his eyebrows and eyelids red and blue, and frighten his enemies by putting on a fierce expression. In old age, his regularity at prayers is unimpeachable, but there is hardly any known narcotic with which he will not stupefy himself. He is essentially a non-fighting man and an unenterprising man. He is ready for any robbery or to back up any villainy, but he has not energy or pluck enough to venture out of his valley to attempt it. Even as a trader, he looks on the 30 miles to Banu as an exceedingly far cry. He will tyrannize over the few Hindu settlers to a cruel degree. The Hindu has to give up a wife if she be good-looking, pay a tax on a son, and a ransom on a daughter's wedding. And though he manages withal to hold the purse strings, he will rather buy off than cope with the Waziri marauder who harries him from time to time, and who has a proverb that one Waziri with one stick is equal to 100 Dawaris. His unnatural licentiousness would have made him conspicuous in Sodom or Gomorrah, and it may fairly be doubted if the requisite number of righteous could be found in the valley to save the Dawar villages from the fate that fell on the cities of the plains. From what wandering horde he originated is not clear. His history is ancient and obscure, but he has remained for centuries shut in by strong, hardy neighbors, and has probably been as nasty for ages, and is only desirous to be let alone to go on in his evil courses for ages to come. The fringe of warlike tribes by which the valley is surrounded has, however, really been its protection from annexation over and over again. It seems to have been included in the Mughal Empire during the time of Aurangzeb, whose son, Bahadur Shah, is said to have levied in person some heavy arrears from the wealthy inhabitants. The Durrani lieutenants occasionally used their armies from coast to extort revenue, and there are stories of a shadowy Sikh jurisdiction, which really relate to mere forays. Though Dawar has at different times been nominally subject to the Kabul authorities, practically it has been, and still is, perfectly independent. In 1855, the government of India, as usual ready to disclaim any intention of moving over the border, renounced any rights in favour of the Emir, Dost Muhammad, though neither he nor his successors were ever strong enough to enter into possession, and the sovereign rights of Kabul remained just as imaginary as before. The people have several times expressed a wish to come under British rule, protesting against being handed over to any other power and begging, if they must be subjects, to be subjects of the Queen. And though the proposal has always been refused, the Indian government has dealt directly with them and, when necessary, proceeded to expeditions or blockades without any reference whatever. Both have had to be resorted to on occasions, either on account of raids and murders by Dawaris or because they provided a rendezvous for others. It is only some few years ago the valley was reported a hotbed of disaffection and fanaticism. The Dawaris, however, may fairly plead it was not until they had asked and been refused aid against the Wazirs that they made friends with the mammon of unrighteousness and became notorious for harbouring rebels against us. Whether or no these Dawaris would make desirable subjects, it is needless to consider. They would not make soldiers, though we could probably enlist their neighbours on both sides. The Jadranis beyond them are a primitive, hospitable race, many of whom excellent workmen, but inveterate beggars, come into Banu to work as navvies in the cold season, where they are nicknamed hill wolves, on account of the amount of earnings they usually carry back with them. They are said to be very well disposed, but their numbers are too insignificant to be taken into account. The strategic value of a position among the well-watered and fertile highlands near the sources of the Tochi and the possession of points like Sharania, Urgan, and Sarafsa that would practically command the highway from Ghazni to Banu cannot be doubted. If the Russians were at Banu instead of ourselves, we should probably hear that a line of railway was in progress. When the line to Banu is completed, and presumably this cannot be long left out of any sound scheme of frontier defence, a continuation up to the eastern slope of the Jadran Hills would be perfectly easy. Nor is there any apparent reason why these highlands should not be successfully crossed, certainly with less difficulty than the same range could be negotiated, vid the Gumal. These crossed, the reports of native surveyors show no special obstacles right onto Ghazni. From Ghazni to Banu is considerably shorter than by any other route, and the principal argument against its adoption is that traders do not use it. This, however, may be a good deal due to causes other than physical difficulties. It is quite off the Kabul and Kandahar lines of traffic, or for enterprising border traders like the Pawandas. Its inhabitants are at the other extreme of the scale, not only the most degraded, but the most unenterprising. The physical difficulties in the way of an occupation are certainly the reverse of formidable. A mere cavalry reconnaissance proved sufficient to carry a scare that was almost a panic throughout the valley. The only expedition against the Dawaris, undertaken in 1872, was an affair of less than 24 hours. Early one morning, some 1,500 of the frontier force fell in, occupied the heights covering the Tochi Pass, cleared and made the road through it passable for guns by breakfast time, marched through, occupied 3 or 4 of the leading villages, and burned their flanking towers by lunch, received the complete submission of the Dawaris, and were on their way back, if not to afternoon tea. At any rate, were all outside the Tochi again for a late dinner. It is at present perhaps unnecessary to annex the Dawar Valley, but that our surveyors, engineers and soldiers should be perfectly free to come and go in it might be reasonably insisted on, to permit so important a line of communication to remain a sealed book, that within a short ride there should be passes a few miles long, with a great fertile valley behind them, affording free access almost to the centre of Afghanistan, but as much closed to us as the Gate of Eden to the Peri, is an obvious absurdity, and to persist in maintaining a curtain immediately in front of our outposts, behind which no British officer is to be allowed to look, to be dependent for our information regarding the country, its capabilities, its strategic positions, and its tribes on native explorers in disguise, stealthily noting in rough sketches and approximating distances regarding which precise information might at any time be of the greatest importance to us. Surveyors whose field books are liable to confiscation and their persons to imprisonment at the hands of our allies, is to persist in a policy that can only be described as fatuous. The Dawar Valley and the Jadran Highlands should at least be as free to us as is Kashmir, and we should be assured that Mahmud's highway to Ghazni is fairly passable in case circumstances should ever compel us to go there, for it is impossible to say how soon such a contingency may arise.